Gresham College presents The Conservative Reaction 1951 to 1965 by Professor Vernon Bogdanor.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a lecture in the series on British post-war history. It's on the 1950s, the Conservative governments of the 1950s. And in the 1950s seemed to many people a golden age, a brief period when the British people thought they were in sight of a promised land that they'd long sought. Even a figure of the left, Tony Benn, called his diaries that covered the years of the 1950s years of hope. And The Economist in June 1954 said, "The miracle has happened, full employment without inflation." Harold Macmillan, who was Prime Minister from 1957 to 63, visited his old constituency, Stockton-on-Tees, which he'd represented between the wars at the height of the Depression. And he'd said, "The wealth and prosperity of the town is incredible." Wigan, where George Orwell famously had written The Road to Wigan Pier in the 1930s, one commentator said that Wigan had been transformed in just one generation from barefoot malnutrition to nylon and television, from hollow idleness to flush contentment. Now, perhaps the real verdict on the 1950s was given by the voters. They twice, in 1955 and 1959, re-elected the Conservatives with increased majorities. The Conservatives got back in 1951 with a small majority of 17 seats, though they had fewer votes than the Labour Party. In 1955, they increased their majority to 63, and in 1959, they increased it to 100. That's something, a government twice increasing its majority, that's never been achieved since the Napoleonic Wars, period of the Napoleonic Wars. Margaret Thatcher increased her majority once from 1979 to 83, but her next victory in 1987, her majority fell, and in 1992, the Conservative majority fell even further. It seems the Conservatives then were in tune with the desire for people for better times. And it was said that the Conservative Party chairman in the late 1950s, Sir Oliver Poole, used to drive every Saturday from his nearby country home to Watford to look at the crowds revelling in the new consumer goods, which they hadn't before been able to afford: cars, television sets, washing machines, refrigerators, and so on. Now, some in the left attacked that, and Honoran Bevan, who you'll remember was Minister of Health in the Attlee government, said that the affluent society was, and I quote, "a vulgar society of which no decent person could be proud." But the voters did not agree, and even when finally the Conservatives were rejected in 1964, they were rejected not because the voters rejected affluence, but because they said the Labour Party could deliver it more effectively. The Conservatives weren't delivering enough affluence, and that Labour would deliver more. So the 1950s was a rare period of hope and confidence in British life, such as I think we haven't really seen in any other decade in the 20th century. Perhaps the 1920s is the nearest. But what I want to emphasise is how much the Attlee Labour government cast its shadow, if you like, over the 1950s and set the agenda for what happened. And I've sometimes thought while preparing these lectures that, in a sense, the whole of post-war history, even the Thatcher period, could be regarded to some extent as an appendix to the Attlee government. And I've been reinforced in my view that the Attlee government set the agenda. But it didn't set the agenda in the way that it actually hoped, because as we saw, the Attlee government hoped that the 1945-51 government would be a first step towards socialism. But in fact, it was an ending as much as a beginning. There was to be no forward march to socialism at all. And the 1945 idea of moving to socialism through public ownership was beginning to seem much less attractive by 1951. partly because the nationalised industries were not working particularly well, and people didn't think, for example, that British Rail, which was nationalised, was a very good advertisement for a socialist society. At least it wasn't working so well that people said, let's have a lot more nationalised industries. Nationalisation was unpopular, and unpopular even amongst Labour voters. By the late 1950s, opinion polls were showing that even the majority of Labour voters were rejecting nationalisation. Now, some of the leaders of the Labour Party were seeing that, and in 1950, Herbert Morrison suggested that the general election slogan for the Labour Party should be consolidation, not perhaps particularly inspiring as an election call. Now, in 1956, Anthony Crossland, a Labour backbencher at the time, published an important book called The Future of Socialism, which was to set the course for Labour right until Tony Blair, I think. Because he said that socialists were in a dilemma in the 1950s. That he said they were radical and contemporary, but those who were radical were not contemporary because they were discontented with a society which no longer exists. In other words, the type of capitalist society that they were criticising, the society of the 1920s and 30s, no longer existed. You had full employment, you had rising living standards, a welfare state, all the sorts of things which many socialists had said you couldn't get under capitalism. So that a lot of the radicals in the Labour Party were out of date. They were attacking the society of the 1930s. That no longer existed. He said other socialists were contemporary but not radical. They realised society had changed, but they quite enjoyed the present one. And he said the important thing for socialists was to change the means by which they hoped to deliver socialism. Socialism was a matter not of institutions, but of values. How are we to achieve those values? Not, he said, primarily through public ownership or nationalisation, but the main socialist aim should be equality, and that should be achieved not through public ownership, but through policies of fiscal redistribution, and also educational policy through comprehensive schools, which he hoped would create a more equal society. And that was resisted by many in the Labour Party, and it led to a running battle between those on the left and those on the right, which was largely responsible for keeping Labour in opposition for 13 years, and possibly was not really resolved until Tony Blair became leader of the Labour Party in 1994. Now, there wasn't then any appetite for further radical policies of nationalisation. But also, there was no public appetite for undoing what the Attlee government had done. The welfare state was very popular, and although people didn't want more nationalisation, they were suspicious of unbridled private enterprise, because they said that would lead you back into the 20s and 30s with high unemployment, and there was no appetite, therefore, for reducing the role of the state. In the popular view, this would lead us back to the 1930s, when untrammelled capitalism, people argued, had caused unemployment, and the absence of the welfare state had been responsible for poverty and such indignities as the means test. So the greatest problem faced by the Conservatives was to show that they could govern without putting the clock back, that the Conservative government wouldn't lead to mass unemployment and poor social conditions. And Harold Macmillan said very wisely in his diary in 1951, after the Conservatives had squeaked back, apparently Attlee believed that he'd be back as Prime Minister by 1953, that he'd be back very quickly. But Macmillan said this, that Labour had fought the election very astutely, not on socialism but on fear. Fear of unemployment, fear of reduced wages, fear of reduced social benefits, fear of war. If before the next election none of these fears have proved reasonable, we may be able to force the opposition to fight on socialism. Then we can win. And that proved very present. That's a fair account of the history of the 1950s and one of the central reasons for the increased Conservative majority. But also the Conservatives turned out to be very lucky, that economic conditions turned out favourable. And the terms of trade began to move in Britain's favour in 1952, because of a fall in commodity prices, so that this enabled the Conservatives to expand the economy. But they also showed, the Conservatives, that they could maintain full employment, they could maintain and improve the welfare state, and therefore that a Conservative government did not mean a return to the 1930s. And so throughout the 1950s, I think, the fear of socialism was much greater than the fear of the Conservatives. So one can say that the Attlee government had created not the first step towards a socialist society, but a new kind of equilibrium which lasted throughout the 1950s. And that equilibrium was a barrier against further socialism, but also against the policies that some Conservatives wanted, of what would now perhaps be called Thatcherism, of return to the market, denationalisation, a much reduced role for the state. And the time of the free market Conservatives would come later, not in the 1950s. So the Conservatives actually did very little to undermine the Attlee government's heritage. They denationalised only the steel and road haulage industries, nothing else. But even that wasn't privatisation of the kind that Margaret Thatcher was later to adopt, because these industries were put under cartels and their production was planned. There was central planning of production. So what you had was continued public control, but without public ownership. It was a comparatively marginal difference. And during the 1950s, the Conservatives consciously rejected two radical attempts to undermine the equilibrium that had been created by the Attlee government. Now, the first attempt to undermine the equilibrium, almost too topical, was to get Britain into Europe. The Attlee government had kept out of the European coal and steel community established in 1951, the precursor of what came to be the common market and then came to be the European Union. And the Churchill government had to decide on what it should do about this when it got to power. Now, earlier in 1940, when Churchill had become leader of the Conservative Party, he defined his central purpose as what he said was the maintenance of the enduring greatness of Britain and her empire. And to retain that greatness in 1951 required, he believed, two things. The first was an end to the period of upheaval that had marked the Attlee government, to maintain the equilibrium. The second was to reassert British power. And how was he to do that? Now, in 1940, British power had seemed in decline. Indeed, it seemed as if we were in danger of losing the war. And Churchill had reasserted British power by a great act of will, if you like, an obstinate refusal to recognise, if you like, realities, to compromise or surrender, even in the face of superior might. And Churchill said that if you showed complete confidence that Britain could win the war by conveying in speech and action a spirit of self-belief, then we would in fact win. And through sheer obstinacy and defiance, Churchill succeeded in reversing what seemed a very desperate situation. Now, could he do the same in the 1950s? Churchill said that the Labour government had followed a policy of what he called scuttle, of withdrawing from Britain's commitments in the world. It had been insufficiently assertive. Could that be reversed by, again, a great expression of will? Now, the trouble is that it couldn't, because whereas the British people were united behind Churchill in the 1940s in being determined to defeat Hitler, whatever the cost, and Churchill said the people had been lion-hearted and he had given the roar. But in the 1950s, they were not equally committed to preserving British rule over Asia and Africa. And Churchill's campaign against Indian self-government had indeed been defeated in the Conservative Party even in the 1930s, and it appeared by the 1950s utterly anachronistic. And Churchill was eventually to recognise that the British people no longer cared, perhaps they never had cared, whether Britain remained an imperial country. And at the end of his life, he said to his private secretary, Anthony Montagu Brown, "I could have defended the British Empire against anyone except the British people." A very wise comment, I think, so that the attempt to assert British power in the empire got nowhere. Now, a second way by which some people believed you could assert British power was by leading the very young, at that time, European movement. And Churchill had seemed to indicate in opposition that he would be prepared to do that. Indeed, even earlier. After the first British victory in the war at Alamein, Churchill wrote to his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, saying this: "I must admit that thoughts rest primarily in Europe, the revival of the glory of Europe, the parent continent of the modern nations and of civilization." And he then made a remarkably prescient comment, which I think would get him expelled from the Conservative Party today, because he said, hard as it is to say now, I look forward to a United States of Europe, in which the barriers between the nations will be greatly minimized and unrestricted travel will be possible. It's in 1942, remarkably prescient. And in his speeches in opposition, he seemed to indicate that he supported Britain becoming part of this Europe. He spoke at the Albert Hall in May 1947 of the idea of a united Europe in which our country will play a decisive part. And he argued that Britain and France should be the founder partners in this movement. He said if Europe united is to be a living force, Britain will have to play her full part as a member of the European family. And then 2 years later, in 1949, he quoted the French foreign minister, who'd said, very different, I think, from the current French foreign minister. He said the French foreign minister had declared in the French parliament that without Britain there can be no Europe. And he said, this is entirely true, but our friends on the continent need have no misgivings. Britain is an integral part of Europe, and we mean to play our part in the revival of her prosperity and greatness. And in the House of Commons in June 1950, shortly before he came to office, he said the Conservative and Liberal parties say, without hesitation, that we are prepared to consider and if convinced to accept the abrogation of national sovereignty, provided we are satisfied with the conditions and the safeguards. The Conservative and Liberal parties declare that national sovereignty is not inviolable and that it may be resolutely diminished for the sake of all the men in all the lands finding their way home together. But in office as Prime Minister, Churchill followed the Labour government in keeping Britain aloof from the European coal and steel community. And that has obviously been a matter of great controversy since then, because pro-Europeans say this was the time when we missed the bus, when we could have shaped Europe to our needs, and it could have been much more sympathetic to British attitudes than it was. They say this was the time when Britain lost the leadership of Europe. People who don't like Europe say that Churchill twice saved this country, in 1940 by action and in 1951 by inaction, when he kept Britain out of the coal and steel community. His Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, was much more sceptical of Europe than Churchill, and he made a speech as Foreign Secretary at Columbia University in January 1952, which you may think, some of you may think at any rate, was prescient, because he was trying to counter the American view that Britain should become part of the European movement. And Eden said this: if you drive a nation to adopt procedures which run contrary to its instincts, you weaken and may destroy the motive force of its action. You will realize that I am speaking of frequent suggestions that the United Kingdom should join a federation on the continent of Europe. And he then said, this is something which we know in our bones we cannot do. Again, that has many echoes, I think, today. And Eden told his private secretary, if you look at the postbag of any English village, he represents a constituency in Warwickshire, a fairly rural constituency, and examine the letters coming in from abroad to the whole population, 90% of them would come from way beyond Europe, in other words, from Australia, New Zealand and Canada, and that was where we belonged. So the Conservatives decided, as Labour had done, to keep out of the European movement. Obviously there are different views about that. But it meant that it was very difficult for Churchill to answer the question of how British power could be reasserted. And as I said, he saw the central purpose of his political career, and I quote, "the maintenance of the enduring greatness of Britain and her empire." But his political career lasted from 1900, the beginning of the century, to 1955, when he retired as Prime Minister. And during that period, you may argue the central theme was the decline of British power, contrary to what Churchill hoped. Perhaps it was inevitable, perhaps no one could have stopped it, but it was decline. And I think Churchill recognised that. He told a political colleague, Lord Boothby, towards the end of his life, he said, "Historians are apt to judge war ministers less by the victories achieved under their direction than by the political results which flowed from them." He says, "Judged by that standard, I am not sure that I shall be held to have done very well." And in retirement, he said to his private secretary that he thought he was a failure. And when his private secretary demurred, perhaps thinking the old man was gaga, Churchill said, "I have worked very hard all my life, and I have achieved a great deal, in the end to achieve nothing." Now, the Churchill regime, perhaps Churchill was too old to achieve, you may say, to achieve what he might have achieved if he'd come to power younger, perhaps even in 1945. But the end of his premiership in 1955 been best described, I think, in words which were written about Bismarck in old age, that he was not a beginning but an end, a grandiose final chord, a fulfiller, not a prophet. And people, I think, felt that when Churchill died in 1965, that it was somehow the end of an era. Now, that wasn't what Churchill wanted. He wanted to reassert British power. He thought, as growing up in the Victorian and Edwardian era, that the world would be a better place if Britain was stronger than she actually was. But he wasn't able to do anything, I think, about that. So that was the first, you may argue, radical attempt, and some of you would think it was a good idea and some a bad idea, to alter Britain's position in the world, to get Britain securely anchored into Europe. Now, the Attlee government had opposed that, and the Churchill government, which seemed at first to be more sympathetic, also took the same view. So here again, I think the Attlee government cast its shadow. The Conservatives didn't do very much different in that era of policy from what the Attlee government would have done. I now come to a radical domestic policy which the Conservatives rejected, to deal with the economy. And this idea was called Robot. And it was called Robot because it was named after three officials who were instrumental in promoting it. Sir Leslie Rowan, who was the head of the Overseas Finance Division of the Treasury, Sir George Bolton, who was an executive governor of the Bank of England, and Sir R.W.B. Clarke, Sir Otto Clarke, the father of Charles Clarke, former Labour minister, who was a second secretary at the Treasury. And if you combine Rowan, Bolton and Otto, you get Robot, or more or less. But it was called Robot for another reason, because the idea was that the economy, instead of being controlled by the state, should be allowed to regulate itself through a floating pound. And the idea was that the pound should float. At that time, perhaps I should add, the pound was not convertible, except in the so-called sterling area. That there was heavy restrictions on changing pounds into dollars or any other currency. And Britain lived behind a tariff wall which had been negotiated in the 1930s. Now, the Robot proposal said you should regulate the economy by the exchange rate. And that, the proponents argued, would do a lot for the British economy. First, it would prevent the unions bidding up wages, because if you bid up wages, the pound would fall and you would get unemployment, and that somehow things would regulate themselves. It would also prevent restrictive practices because, again, the pound would float downwards. And therefore, turning to the market would give you increased productivity and industrial efficiency, so that individuals would be influenced by the operation of the price mechanism, not by appeals from the state as regards their economic circumstances. And the proponents of robot persuaded the Chancellor of the Exchequer under the Conservatives, R.A. Butler, to support this proposal, and it was discussed in Cabinet in 3 sessions in February 1952. I should add this was all secret. It wasn't known until much later. It was kept away from the public. It was defeated in Cabinet. It lingered on for the rest of the year, but then died. And the implications were very radical indeed. If the pound floated downwards, which would probably have happened in 1952, import prices would rise and the cost of living would increase, and it would stimulate wage demands. Now, the government were very frightened that if that happened, unemployment would increase and the bargaining power of the unions would be weakened. And then people said that the Conservatives would be accused of taking us back to the 1930s, of wanting to weaken the trade unions and increasing unemployment. And Churchill felt this particularly strongly because he'd been Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1925 when Britain had returned to the gold standard at the wrong rate, so it was argued, and that this had led to unemployment. And the Churchill government, as I implied earlier, was dedicated to the maintenance of social peace and consensus, and they said this would destroy it. It would cause unemployment and social dislocation. Now, later on, not at the time, people said that the refusal to accept robot was a turning point in the history of post-war Britain. Nigel Lawson, a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer under Margaret Thatcher, who later resigned after disagreement with her, said that it was the fork in the road and that it would have made Thatcherism unnecessary. Now, in the short run, the rejection of robot appeared sensible because, as I've said, the terms of trade in 1952 turned in Britain's favour. Britain was gaining a windfall benefit. And the 1950s seemed, it was, a period of affluence. But if you say that the British economy had very serious long-term problems, not of short-term readjustment to the results of the war, but of long-term failure of productivity, restrictive practices, market rigidities, and so on, and that all this, as the supporters of Margaret Thatcher would argue, was sustained by the cosy corporate consensus of Labour and the Conservatives, then you will say it's a pity people didn't take a chance. Writing in the 1980s, a man who had been a civil servant in the 50s, Lord Plowden, he said in the 1980s, there was a lack of appreciation of how weak economically this country had become. I do not believe that at that time any minister, shadow minister, official, journalist, commentator, or the general public truly grasped the real extent of our economic difficulties and our economic weakness. And if you take that view, you may argue that robot, perhaps it was premature, but it was far-sighted, an attempt to remedy a condition much more serious than it was believed to be. And those who say that say it was a plausible diagnosis of the British disease in the early 1950s and a clever political manoeuvre to confront that disease. But in the circumstances of the time, its supporters had to downplay the objectives and they lost the argument. But 30 years later, the same strategy was again attempted, and it was then, you may think, perhaps inappropriately labelled Thatcherism. It came up again in the 1980s when people faced, really, as they thought, much greater worries about Britain's economic progress. So you may take the view it was a far-sighted attempt to deal with the serious weaknesses of the British economy, but you may also take the alternative view that it would so have upset the trade unions and led to so much unemployment that it was right not to adopt it, and in particular that a Conservative government, which had to prove itself, could never adopt such a policy. I think politically it was really impossible for the government to adopt it, but there were many people who thought that we should. Now, I've said that no one predicted. The Conservatives came to office in 1951 in a bit of economic difficulty after the Korean War. No one predicted the windfall benefit from the terms of trade in the spring of 1952, and that meant it was fairly easy for a government in power then to get itself re-elected. And it does raise all sorts of speculations about what would have happened if Attlee, instead of going to the country in October 1951, had held on to the spring of 1952. Of course, he couldn't foresee this. He had a majority of only 6. They were old and tired men in office and perhaps relieved to leave. But if they could have held on till 52, Labour might have been in power throughout the 1950s, and then there wouldn't have been, I think, a great deal more nationalisation, but there would probably have been more fiscal redistribution, and we might have moved in a Swedish direction, whether that's better or worse, obviously for you to decide, but it perhaps was a narrower margin that we didn't become, if you like, a more socialist or social democratic society. But as I said, in the 1950s, affluence seemed the key happening. And perhaps the thing that most people remember about the 1950s is a famous speech by Harold Macmillan, who was Prime Minister from 1957 to 1963, with a remark about "we've never had it so good." And that speech, I think, is much misunderstood. And I'm therefore going to quote what Macmillan actually said. "You've never had it so good" was never actually used as a slogan in any general election, as is often said in 1959. The nearest to it was the slogan, "Life's better under the Conservatives, don't let Labour ruin it," which isn't quite the same. But what Macmillan said, it was in a speech in Bedford in July 1957, and you have to remember the background, that this affluence was quite new to him and other people, and he'd represented a constituency with very high unemployment in the interwar years. And what he said was this: "Let us be frank about it. Most of our people have never had it so good." He didn't say you've never had it. Most of our people. And then he spoke about those on fixed incomes who faced problems with inflation, pensioners in particular. But he said, "Go around the country, go to individual towns, go to the farms, and you will see a prosperity such as we have never had in my lifetime, nor indeed in the history of this country. What is beginning to worry some of us is it too good to be true? Or perhaps I should say, is it too good to last? For amidst all this prosperity, there is one problem that has troubled us in one way or another. Can prices be steadied while at the same time we maintain full employment in an expanding economy? Can we control inflation? This is the problem of our time. The great mass of the country has, for the time being at any rate, been able to contract out of the effects of rising prices, but they will not be able to contract out forever if inflation prices us out of world markets. For if that happens, we will be back in the old nightmare of unemployment. The older ones among you," he said, "will know what this means. I hope the younger ones will never have to learn it." And far from being a boast, as the speech is usually portrayed as "you've never had it so good," it's "most of our people have never had it so good," it's in the context of a warning about how fragile it will be if there are dangers of inflation. And you may say it's a sort of speech Margaret Thatcher might have made, and it very much predicted what was going to happen in the future when we were, in fact, priced out of world markets. But it's always very dangerous, I think, for a politician to coin a phrase because it's misleading. And Macmillan was a very good phrase maker, but he's remembered for spreading a mood of complacency. "You've never had it so good," which certainly wasn't that speech. Another example, which I gave some time ago, was Neville Chamberlain's famous comment after the Munich Agreement in 1938, "It means peace for our time," which he didn't believe and didn't mean, but he was labelled by it. So I think that was a very important part of Macmillan being misunderstood. And by 1959, 1960, after the third Conservative election victory, Macmillan and others became extremely worried about the fragile basis of British prosperity. And there was a change in what one might call elite opinion at that time, which is very difficult and almost impossible to explain why it happened, but it's absolutely fundamental to understanding what happened in the next phase of history in the 1960s. Because up to about 1959-60, people said, this country is doing very well. We're doing so much better than we were in the 20s and 30s or even the 1940s. There are some reasons why we've got good reasons to feel pleased with ourselves. And the Conservatives perhaps deserve credit for that. Good, we'll elect them. Things are going much better than they were. Around about 1959 and 1960, people said, but other countries are doing far better than Britain. The Germans, the Japanese, the French, we're doing very badly. They are consistently outgrowing Britain. Now, in the 1950s, Britain's growth rate was good in historic terms, much better than the interwar years. We were growing faster than at any time since the Victorian era. But we weren't doing well when compared with Germany and Japan and France. But then for most of the time since the Victorian era, we hadn't done well compared with those countries. And it's rather like if you can, I think I said this last time in a slightly garbled form, it's as if you can, you used to be able to run a mile in 7 minutes, and you can now run a mile in 6 minutes. You're rather pleased with yourself. But your next door neighbour can run a mile in 5 minutes, and you say, well, why can't I do that? Perhaps you're just not physically equipped to do it, we don't know. But that wasn't the argument people began to adopt in the 1960s. That we've got to increase the British rate of growth. And the problem that governments faced was they weren't too clear about how to deal with inflation in the 1950s. They had even less idea about how to increase the rate of growth. Indeed, I think probably economists still aren't sure, though most of their solutions, it seems to me, work only in the very long term. For example, if you want to improve the rate of growth, one of the things that Margaret Thatcher did, you improve labour market flexibility. That was by weakening the position of the trade unions. That took time to work its way through. You improve the quality of management education. You improve the quality of technical education, and so on. But these aren't things that will happen between one election and the next. They will take time to work their way through. And governments got themselves in the position of saying, we can do this by the next election. If you elect us, and both the Conservative and the Labour Party said, we will increase the rate of growth. And the Conservatives in the early 1960s said we must be much more ambitious. We must have a growth rate target of 4% per year. Now, we hadn't achieved such a rate of growth since mid-Victorian times, and it wasn't clear how to do it. The Labour Party said 4% was too unambitious. We should go for even more than 4%. But how were you to do that? The parties weren't particularly clear. Now, this meant disturbing that equilibrium which had been created by the Attlee government, and which in the 1950s the Conservatives accepted more or less willingly. Their critics said they were complacent about it, but more or less willingly. The Conservatives now said, after 1959, that the post-war settlement needed adjustment and reform. It was no longer enough to go on as we had been in the 50s. It needed reform. People on the extremes of politics, as they were then seen, said it was inadequate, get rid of it. People on the left, the far left, said continue perhaps the work of the Attlee government, move much more radically to a socialist society, perhaps of the Swedish direction. They said Sweden is an efficient society, Britain moves in that direction. We can also become more efficient, perhaps through greater egalitarianism. People who were seen as on the right said dismantle a lot of the state apparatus, establish a neoliberal type of economy. The main representative of that branch of thinking in the 1950s was Enoch Powell on the right, just as on the left it was Aneurin Bevan. And Enoch Powell, later on it came to be Margaret Thatcher. And they said, the right said, don't drift into competing with Labour by extending the role of the state, but look radically at the post-war commitments we've made. Can we afford them? Should we afford them? perhaps the welfare state isn't quite right. Perhaps it doesn't encourage incentives and economic growth. Perhaps we should denationalise a lot more industries and so on, radically reform the economy, the origins, if you like, of Thatcherism. But that wasn't the mainstream view of either the Conservative or Labour parties. They said the settlement is basically right, but it needs some sorts of reforms so as to strengthen it. If you like, an effect of post-war optimism, we can do it. Just as we built up the welfare state, we had nationalisation, educational reform and so on. If we want to, we can reform the system. By the 1970s and 80s, by the time Margaret Thatcher got there, the general view was something much more radical was needed. But the first step taken in the 1960s was to try and put the settlement right with various sorts of reforms. Now, the first reform which the Conservatives put forward, you may think from a current position rather odd for a Conservative government, were policies of planning in the economy. And Harold Macmillan had been greatly influenced in the 1930s by the writings of John Maynard Keynes. It's, I think, no coincidence. His publisher, he was, the Macmillan firm was the publisher of Keynes' works, and he'd known Keynes well, and believed that interwar unemployment could have been cured by Keynesian methods. And he wrote a book in the 1930s called The Middle Way, advocating that. And his Chancellor, Selwyn Lloyd, after 1960, had been a liberal at Cambridge in the 1920s, and again, was very much influenced by Keynesian ideas. And so, around about 1960, there was a reappraisal of British policy, and they said we need much more planning in the economy. And the first thing they did, the Conservatives did in 1961, was to set up a body called the National Economic Development Council, NEDI. It was known by NEDI, in which government, trade unions and employers would all get together and try and deal with the weaknesses in the British economy and see how it could be improved. And then in 1962, they set up the first of many attempts, all of which failed, to secure an incomes policy. They set up a National Incomes Commission, which was known as NICI, so you had NEDI and NICI, and that was to try and plan with the trade unions incomes policy, or as it was sometimes put perhaps euphemistically, the planned growth of wages. And the government said we can't really get anywhere to secure our aims without the cooperation of management and unions, and therefore we need the cooperation of both sides of industry, as it was said. And at the beginning, the trade unions seemed to go along with that, really. The General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress, George Woodcock, said the trade unions would help the Conservatives. They would monitor individual unions' wage claims, as they'd done in 1948. There was voluntary wage restraint. And they would try and help this policy. But you may say, this is a very odd position for a Conservative government to be getting into. The state management of the economy, beginning to go back to the world of controls and planning and so on. Surely, if you're a Conservative, you should be against that sort of thing. You should think the state can't do all that. And you may argue that it lost the intellectual initiative for the Conservatives, paved the way for Labour, because people said, well, if you, in the 1950s, you said Conservative freedom works, that we can get a long way without increasing the role of the state. If you now say that to increase the rate of economic growth we need a stronger state, why not go along with those people who really believe in it, namely the Labour Party? So there was some continuation with the policies of the government which succeeded the Conservatives, led by Harold Wilson, the Labour government in 1964. It made for a very different sort of conservatism from what people have been accustomed to in the past. It was sometimes called, not as a compliment, a corporate conservatism, which Harold Macmillan and Edward Heath, their governments, are particularly associated with. And as I said, they had a target of 4% level of growth, but in my view, no one knew how to achieve it. And very odd for a Conservative government to strengthen the state. And someone once said that economics was the science of getting things wrong with confidence. And both parts in the 1960s, we've got to emphasise economic growth. Government was put all its weight behind that. The consequence was we grew slower in the 1960s than we had in the 1950s when governments hadn't given their attention to economic growth. We grew more slowly and with more difficulties than we had in the 1950s. And the further effect of that policy inevitably was to strengthen the position of the trade unions because you needed their cooperation. They began to get a veto power over policy, which led, many would say, to the breakdown of relationships between unions and the state, the end of Ernest Bevin's ideal in the winter of discontent of 1978-9. So that was one branch of policy. The next branch of policy was to say we should recognise we made a mistake earlier in keeping out of Europe, and we should join in the common market, as the European Union was then called, partly for diplomatic reasons, but I think largely for economic reasons, that here was a large growing market which was going to establish a common tariff, and if we weren't careful, we'd be kept out of it, and Europe would discriminate against us. And on the other hand, this larger market would be a great incentive for Britain. The competition would help British industry. We could start growing again, so that too would be very important. People talked a lot at that time of the cold shower of competition, that Europe was an expanding market, we could expand our export trade. Because people said export costs were too high, industry was riddled with restrictive practices, the rate of technical progress was low, but open competition was just the shock needed to make industry more effective. And the president of the Board of Trade, Reginald Maudling, later become Conservative Chancellor in the Macmillan government, said, "We must look at the problem of our trading relations with Europe as an opportunity and a challenge. I think the great effect of going into a wider European market will be that the efficient firms will prosper and the inefficient will go down. That surely is precisely what we must see in this country if our economy is really to expand and our growth is to be more rapid." Now, these two policies, growth and Europe, were somehow interlinked, because when people looked at France, they looked at France rather more than they did at Germany. They said France has prospered because she's got policies of national planning, and they were put forward largely by Jean Monnet, who was also one of the founders of the common market. And Monnet had a great believer in the power of planners. They would tend to be non-elected people, what would now be called technocrats. France, because her political system in the 1950s had been weak, had great influence to civil servants in a body called the Commissariat du Plan, which did what its name suggests, laid down plans for industry, which industry was expected to follow. And Monnet laid that also down for the European Union. It's why the European Commission, which is not elected, has such an important role. Monnet tended to believe that great wisdom lay in non-elected people. He never actually stood for election to anything himself. He operated from behind the scenes. So that those were linked together. Now, the trouble is that all this meant a great challenge to all sorts of vested and cherished interests. I mentioned first the trade unions, but the coming into Europe meant a great change in our agricultural position, because we subsidised agriculture in a different way from the continental countries. We subsidised it through the system of taxation. They did so by guaranteed prices, which were higher than prices you got on the open market. So it meant that we, losing the access to cheap food, which we had from the Commonwealth countries, in particular New Zealand and Australia, would have to pay higher prices for our food. The rationale of that in the continental countries was it would give you security of supply. But of course, behind that was the self-interest, if you like, of the French and to some extent the Germans, who had much larger agricultural sectors than ours. We had a very small agricultural sector, and therefore were not going to benefit much from a common agricultural policy. The French would benefit the most, but the German, particularly farmers in Bavaria, would also benefit. And this illustrates, I think, one of the points about the European Union or the European engagement, because some people say, well, if only we joined earlier, we could have moulded Europe to our interests. But you may argue that the economic structure of the countries of the original six was so different from that of Britain that we would have had to adjust anyway to a different agricultural system and a different system of taxation. of subsidising agriculture, and that we wouldn't have been able to get our own way on all these matters. And that would be the argument of those who say that really that this is not an enterprise where the British could ever hope to achieve fulfilment, and that's obviously what a lot of people think today. It's an open argument. The hope was that we somehow had the great flexibility to adapt. That's what at least Edward Heath thought particularly strongly. But it may be we were too conservative with a small c and we didn't want to adapt to Europe. I didn't see why we should. But that argument became very strong in the early 1960s. And when Macmillan made the first application to join in 1961, I think he believed we were in a much stronger position than actually we were, and that Europe was so eager to have Britain in that she would concede Britain's needs, particularly in the field of agriculture. It's possible he might have got better terms if he'd tried to get in earlier before de Gaulle was strongly entrenched in France. He thought he could safeguard the cheap food policy. That was not going to be possible, and it wasn't possible when we joined the European community. And Edward Heath, who was Macmillan's chief negotiator, said, "I am sure you will understand," he said to the Six, "that Britain could not join the European community under conditions in which this trade connection was cut, that is with New Zealand, Australia, Canada and so on, with grave loss and even ruin for some of the Commonwealth countries." Well, the continental countries did not understand that, or if they did understand it, they weren't willing to make concessions for Britain, and so there was great difficulty. And by the time Britain had made the concessions, it was too late anyway, because de Gaulle was strong enough to veto Britain in 1963. Now, I've said that planning was an aberration for the Conservatives, because on the whole, if you're a Conservative, you tend to be a bit sceptical of the use of the state, and you may say Macmillan, therefore, was a bit of an aberration in the 60s, and later Heath, in policies of planning and incomes policy. But you may say, and I think this is clearly on view now, that Europe is also an aberration for the Conservatives, because the Conservatives, after all, are a patriotic party, the party of British identity and so on. And it's surprising that they should be moving into what was a supranational community. You might think it's more natural for a party of the left, internationalist, but at that time this wasn't the case, and the Labour Party was, again, contrary to its position now, was on the whole opposed to entry into the European community. And the then leader of the Labour Party, Hugh Gaitskell, who was on the whole seen as being on the right, he won great support amongst the centre and left of the Labour Party by putting the Labour Party in 1962 against entry, at least on the kinds of terms the Conservatives would like to get, and saying that Britain ought to be particularly careful of joining any federal Europe. And he used another phrase which has resonated, like Macmillan never had it so good. He said it would be the end of 1,000 years of history for us to join a supranational or federal system. So this is another aberration in amongst the Conservative governments, but continued by the Labour Party in 1964. And gradually the conception of government was beginning to alter, and in particular the role of the trade unions, the Labour movement government, was becoming much closer. And governments from 1964 to 1979, to the time when Margaret Thatcher came to power, suffered great defeats at the hands of the trade union movement. And the greatest defeats of the Wilson government of 64 to 70, and then the Wilson-Callaghan government of 1974 to 9, came not from their Conservative opponents, but from their supposed allies in the trade union movement. Because in 1969, Wilson, in order to strengthen these policies of planning, he put forward a policy for reform of the trade unions called In Place of Strife, which the trade unions forced and hostile Labour backbenchers forced him to abandon in 1969. Then Edward Heath adopted policies of a statutory incomes policy challenged by the miners. Heath went to the country in February 1974 and asked who governed Britain, to which the answer was, you don't. And he was defeated on that. And the Labour government, which succeeded Heath, claimed to have a compact with the unions, a so-called social contract, but that broke down in the winter of discontent, which, as I said, was the end of Ernest Bevin's dream of organised labour as an estate of the realm, with being associated with the government. So by that time, we were moving into a system in which the post-war settlement was breaking down. And in my next lecture, I want to talk about why that post-war settlement broke down and the ideology which succeeded it, which is often called, perhaps misleadingly, Thatcherism. Thank you.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.